Welcome back to Tiger Moon. Today we're beginning season 2 of The Haunted Village. For those who are new to the story, here's a quick recap. The story follows a young man named Ramin who is sent to a remote mountain village as a soldier teacher during his military service. But teaching isn't the only challenge waiting for him. The villagers believe they share the village with intelligent beings that are not human, and things become far more terrifying when Ramin begins seeing those creatures with his own eyes. So, if you're ready, let's find out what happened after Ramin returned from his leave. After that night, I went home on leave. By then, almost the entire country had been buried beneath heavy snow and endless rain. I spent nearly my whole vacation at home. The only useful thing I managed to do was sell my motorcycle. I didn't want to go back to the village completely broke and end up borrowing money from someone again. With a heavy heart, I said goodbye to my family. This time, my mother had packed an extra backpack for me. Carrying that thing felt like dragging an elephant on my shoulders. Somehow, I finally reached the district center. The streets were still covered in thick snow, making it obvious that a powerful storm had hit the area. Waiting for Ismail seemed to take forever. I kept worrying that he might not come, forcing me to spend the night there. Fortunately, around noon, Ismail's old yellow van finally appeared from the traffic circle. The moment I got in, he said, "The road to the village was completely blocked until just 2 days ago." I sighed and shook my head. Just my luck." Ismail chuckled. "You should be thanking God." I frowned. "Why?" "A few days ago, the roof of the school collapsed." I immediately sat upright. "What? The school roof collapsed?" "Yeah, teacher. The students found it on the morning of their exams. Since then, they've been taking their exams inside the mosque." I honestly didn't know whether I should feel relieved or worried. The rest of the journey passed with my head full of questions. As soon as we reached the village, I headed straight toward the school to see the damage myself. But from the health clinic onward, the road had turned into such a muddy mess that I couldn't go any farther. With all the luggage I was carrying, I would have sunk into the mud. Then I remembered the clinic, maybe the doctor had returned. I walked over and tried the front door. Locked. The entire building was silent. Since I had left the keys with Mohammed Javad before going on leave, there was no way for me to get inside. For a moment I had no idea what to do. Finally, I left my bags beside the clinic entrance and headed toward the mosque. The noon prayer had just ended and several villagers were still sitting inside. The moment they saw me, their faces lit up with smiles. The village council had officially closed the school until the end of the month. Builders were supposed to come from the city once the roads became passable and rebuild the damaged roof. Until then, all classes would be held in the mosque's small library. At first, I felt relieved. At least I thought I'd have somewhere to sleep. Still, I wanted to make sure. So, the school's closed, the doctor's gone. I guess I'll be sleeping here in the mosque, right? One of the elderly men straightened his back and smiled. "No, young man, that wouldn't be appropriate. I've got a house, it's completely empty, and you're welcome to stay there until the school is repaired. God willing, the doctor will return soon. We really need him during the winter." Everyone quietly offered a prayer for the doctor's late mother. Only then did it hit me. So, she had finally passed away. After the meeting, I climbed into the old man's pickup truck. It was white except for a blue hood that looked like it had been replaced years ago. Since all my belongings were still at the clinic, I tried dropping a hint. "I wish I hadn't left my bags at the clinic." Without even looking at me, he replied while unlocking the truck door, "Don't worry, nobody's going to touch them. Let me take you to the house first. I've got a lot of work to do." The moment I sat down, I regretted saying anything. Instead of driving toward the village, the old man headed straight toward the abandoned hill. The further we drove, the more nervous I became. I kept hoping he'd suddenly turn into one of the village alleys. He never did. Instead, he kept driving until we reached a lonely brick house standing at the end of a narrow lane surrounded by snow. He stopped the truck and handed me a key. "Everything you need is already there. I checked yesterday. Even the water tank hasn't frozen. Stay here until the school is rebuilt." Before I could ask another question, he got back into his truck and drove away. He didn't even come inside to show me around. Well, as the saying goes, you don't inspect the teeth of a gift horse. When I unlocked the gate, I stepped into a small courtyard. There was an old outdoor toilet in one corner. Across from the entrance, a stairway led down into a basement, while a short flight of steps climbed up to the main house. A few minutes later, I realized the old man hadn't been exaggerating. The place really was fully furnished and surprisingly comfortable. Still, One question kept bothering me. Was I really allowed to stay here for free? While I was thinking about it, my stomach growled. My mother had packed enough pasta and groceries to feed an army, but they were all sitting back at the clinic in the freezing cold. So I headed back toward the village. Snow had been shoveled away from the roads and piled along the stone walls. I couldn't help smiling. At least the school was closed. And for now, I was finally free from that cursed hill. I picked up my backpack and walked toward the village center. On the way, I stopped at the little grocery store to buy some soy meat, onions, and tomato paste. As I stepped back outside, I froze. The strange old woman was standing in front of the public notice board. She was staring at the papers as if she were actually reading them. I tried to sneak past her without making a sound, but at the very last moment, she slowly turned her head. For several long seconds, those cursed eyes locked onto mine. My heart nearly stopped. I hurried down the narrow lane until I finally reached the house. That's when another uneasy feeling crept over me. The house they had given me was the closest occupied building to the abandoned hill. The very hill where people claimed the spirits of dead sorcerers still wandered. The nearest neighbor lived at least 200 meters away. In that lonely lane, I was completely alone. The freezing winter air forced me inside. Like always, I decided to make pasta. I unpacked my groceries and began frying onions for the sauce. On the left side of the kitchen was a storage room separated only by a thin white curtain. As I stirred the onions, something caught the corner of my eye. Someone was standing behind that curtain. I could clearly make out the dark outline of a human figure. My hand froze. Slowly, I turned toward the storage room. The figure was still there. It didn't seem interested in leaving. Heart pounding, I stepped closer, until I could actually hear it breathing. I whispered, "In the name of God." Then I grabbed the curtain and pulled it aside. The storage room was empty. Nothing, except a few red plastic water containers. Trying to convince myself that it had all been my imagination, I tied the curtain back so it wouldn't move again. Lunch was almost ready. Just then, someone knocked on the front door. When I opened the door, I found Mohammed Javad standing outside, bundled up in a thick jacket and a wool hat. In one hand, he was carrying a plastic bag full of chickens. After exchanging greetings, I asked him about the chickens. He told me that a few nights before the school roof collapsed, he had taken them home because he was afraid the freezing weather would leave them stiff and weak. That simple decision had saved my little business from falling apart. He politely accepted the money for the chickens but refused to stay for lunch, saying he had already eaten. As I sat there eating my pasta, I asked, "So, when do you think the school will be ready again?" Mohammed shrugged. "I honestly don't know. Maybe not until Nowruz." That answer crushed my mood. Trying to cheer me up, he smiled and said, "Why are you so disappointed? This place is much better than that tiny room at the market." I sighed. "Not really. This place is haunted too." He laughed. "Come on. I've lived here my whole life and I've never seen anything unusual. If something happens, just call me. My house is close by." Then he added casually, "Besides, you don't have to worry about that old woman anymore." I looked at him with my mouth still full of food. "What do you mean?" He looked away before answering. "Nothing. She's dead." The pasta nearly got stuck in my throat. My appetite disappeared instantly. Seeing my expression, Mohammed forced a smile. "What? Don't tell me you actually liked her." I swallowed with difficulty. "Stop joking. I saw her standing outside the mosque less than half an hour ago." He slapped his knee and laughed. "You probably saw someone else. Half the old women in this village look the same. Even my own mother is barely 4 feet tall." He was obviously exaggerating. Maybe I could mistake someone's face. But not those eyes. I would recognize those cursed eyes among 100 people. Curiosity got the better of me. "So, how did she die?" Mohammed's smile faded. "One morning, the villagers found her frozen body lying beside the road. They washed her, prayed over her, and buried her in the cemetery behind the hill." He paused, but that wasn't the end of it. "The man responsible for burying the dead had a terrible nightmare that very first night. The next morning, he went to the village sheikh and told him about it. The sheikh simply told him to give charity and forget about it. But the exact same nightmare came back the following night. This time, he was so terrified that he ran to the sheikh's house in the middle of the night. The following morning, the village elders gathered to hear his story. When they finished listening, they all agreed it had to be a sign. They decided the old woman couldn't remain buried in the village cemetery. Since she had no family and nobody to object, they dug up her grave that very day and buried her several kilometers away. After that, the nightmares stopped. Every word made me more uneasy. Even in death, that woman refused to leave me alone. Still, there was one thing I had to know. What exactly did he see in that dream? Even Mohammed looked uncomfortable answering. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. He said he dreamed he was walking toward the cemetery. When he reached the top of the hill, he saw people sitting on every single grave, from the top of the hill all the way down. Many of them weren't even wearing modern clothes. The moment they saw him, they started cursing him. They kept shouting, "Who is this woman you've buried among us?" Then he noticed Safura's grave. He said the other dead couldn't even rest because of her. He sighed. She was probably involved with jinn, just like her husband. You know how these people are. They deny everything. Mohammed stayed with me until late afternoon, before finally heading home. Part of me wanted to ask him to stay the night, but I knew he'd only do it out of politeness. After he left, I went down into the basement to check on my chickens. The place was a complete mess. I made a mental note to clean it up before the chickens got sick. I scattered some grain across the floor and went back upstairs. I skipped the evening prayer at the mosque. Honestly, I didn't feel like walking alone through that long, freezing, deserted path after dark. Instead, I sat in front of the television, cracking sunflower seeds until around 9 o'clock. After dinner, I felt like making tea. There was an old kerosene samovar in the kitchen. It looked perfectly usable until I tried lighting it. Empty. Then I remembered seeing several fuel containers downstairs while checking on the chickens. I grabbed the small red fuel can sitting beside the samovar and headed back outside. The snowfall had stopped, but the freezing wind still swept through the courtyard. I switched on the basement light and opened the door. The first thing I looked for was the chickens. They were all huddled together beside a barrel. None of them had touched the grain. That wasn't normal. Those birds never turned down food. I closed the basement door and picked up one of the kerosene containers. It was still half full. After searching everywhere for a funnel and finding nothing, I carefully tilted the container to fill the small can. As the kerosene slowly poured, I suddenly noticed something strange. The air inside the basement had become much colder. There wasn't even a draft. For a second I wondered if the basement door had somehow opened. I turned around, still closed. I shook off the feeling and kept pouring. That's when all 4 chickens suddenly exploded into panic. They flapped their wings wildly, scattering feathers everywhere. My heart nearly stopped. I thought maybe they had spotted a snake or a scorpion. But under the light, I couldn't see anything. Trying to calm myself, I decided to splash a little kerosene across the floor. If some animal was hiding nearby, the smell might drive it away. Before I could finish filling the can, something black, like a dark blur, slammed into it. The chickens erupted into chaos again. The fuel can flew from my hands, spilling kerosene across the floor. Without thinking, I snatched it up and bolted for the stairs. I was so terrified that I completely forgot to switch off the basement light. Back inside the house, I locked the front door behind me. While lighting the samovar, I kept trying to explain everything logically. Maybe it had been a hedgehog, or perhaps a weasel hiding downstairs. That would explain why the chickens were frightened. But then another thought crossed my mind. If a weasel had gotten inside, there wouldn't have been a single chicken left alive. Even though I couldn't stop worrying about them, there was no way I was going back down there that night. I'd clean the basement first thing in the morning. About an hour later, the water finally began to boil. Just as I stood up to make tea, a heavy sound echoed across the roof. Thud, 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 as if someone was running overhead. Before I even had time to look up, the television screen suddenly dissolved into static. I rushed out into the courtyard. From below, I couldn't see anyone on the roof. Just as I was about to head back inside, I heard voices drifting from the abandoned houses nearby. Several people were walking down the hill. From bits of their conversation I gathered, they were heading to the public bathhouse. For some reason, hearing ordinary voices made me feel a little safer. Even though I couldn't see them, I guess there were probably 3 people. I convinced myself everything was fine and went back inside. A few moments later, the footsteps started again. Louder this time. Someone was definitely running across my roof. Without hesitation, I locked the front door and called Mohammed. When Mohammed answered the phone, I told him that several people were running across the roof of my house. He immediately told me to lock the door and wait for him. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of several motorcycles stopping outside. I rushed into the yard. When I opened the gate, Mohammed was standing there with a few friends about our age. I quickly explained everything. Without even bothering to use a ladder, one of the boys climbed the courtyard wall and jumped onto the roof. A few seconds later, he came back. "Nobody's up there." Mohammed looked at me. "It was probably just the wind. There's nowhere to go from that roof anyway." Still trying to defend myself, I pointed toward the television. "Then who cut the antenna cable?" Mohammed shouted to his friend to check it. A moment later, the boy replied, "The cable's been disconnected." He asked if I had a screwdriver. I searched the entire house but couldn't find one. Eventually, he managed to reconnect the cable using nothing more than a kitchen knife. As they were leaving, Mohammed's friends exchanged strange smiles and winked at each other. I had no idea what they meant. Before getting on his motorcycle, Mohammed asked, "Do you want me to stay here tonight?" I desperately wanted to say yes, but somehow it felt like someone else answered for me. "No." The word came out so cold that it sounded almost insulting. Even Mohammed looked hurt. Still, he pretended nothing had happened. As he started his motorcycle, he simply said, "If anything happens, call me." I stood there speechless until they disappeared into the darkness. The moment they were gone, guilt hit me. I couldn't understand why I'd answered him like that. Back inside the yard, something immediately felt different. Something had changed. I looked around again and again, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Then, as soon as I stepped inside the house, I realized the basement light had somehow turned itself off. I was too exhausted to think about it anymore. I locked the front door once again, lit the samovar, and made myself a cup of tea. Around 11 o'clock, I sat in front of the television with the steaming cup in my hand. Slowly, without realizing it, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, the tea was still hot. I stretched and happened to glance at the clock on the wall. A few minutes past 3 in the morning. The tea was still steaming. For a second, I actually became afraid of the cup itself. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It matched the wall clock exactly. My mind couldn't make sense of any of it. I hurried to the kitchen. The samovar was almost completely out of water. Another few minutes and it probably would have burned dry. I quickly refilled it and turned the flame down. Then I returned to the living room. The tea I'd been holding just moments earlier was now as cold as the snow outside. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I hadn't. I was sitting there trying to convince myself everything had a logical explanation. When someone knocked on the front door, I immediately checked the time again. Still, a few minutes after 3 in the morning. Who would come to my house at that hour? I stepped into the courtyard and called out, "Who's there?" A weak voice answered, "It's Mohammed Javad." I walked toward the gate and stopped. That wasn't Mohammed's voice. Which Mohammed Javad? Silence, no answer. There was no way I was opening that door. While I stood frozen in the courtyard, I heard those same voices again. This time they were walking from the village toward the abandoned houses. One of them was laughing while talking about how nice the public bathhouse had been. My curiosity immediately took over. The bathhouse wasn't even open at 3 in the morning, so where exactly were these people coming from? Since I didn't dare unlock the front gate, I leaned a ladder against the wall and climbed onto the roof instead. I could hear them perfectly. But I couldn't see a single person. I wish I had never looked. Even today, the memory of what I saw still haunts me. Finally, in the darkness beyond the hill, I saw them. 3 goats. They were the ones making all those human voices. That concludes part 1 of season 2 of The Haunted Village. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to leave a like and help the video reach more people. As the poet says, "A false friend cannot be cured of betrayal. A bird never knows the branch will become its cage. Stay safe, God. With respect, Tiger Moon."